Welcome to our very first show, Dr. Buranaj. First of all, congratulations on the recent election.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure the Democrats are really happy. Now, the question that automatically leads from that is there going to be a general election?
I think the local election signified an important milestone after the political unrest that elections have been held successfully and peacefully. I think that this resumption to normalcy is a very important signal to send both to Thais and to other countries that democracy can be continued, and I think the violence and the disruptions outside of parliament now has been brought into the normal realm of politics once again.
Do you think that this election signifies the country has a confidence in the Democrats, so to say?
Well, I think more importantly the wish of the people that has reflected in the results of the election very much shows that I think it has confidence in the direction this country is heading after the recent spate of demonstrations of violence. And I think the reconciliation plan that the Prime Minister has proposed will be a way to reunite Thailand once again. And I think in some ways the results of the election signifies that.
You speak of the Prime Minister's reconciliation plan. Now, do you feel that the strongest way forward is to somewhat marginalize the other side by not letting them speak? Because there's indications that the government has gone through steps to lessen the voice of the Pheu Thais or the other side. So.
Yeah. Well, in fact, that would be the wrong thing to do if that were the case. I think
Do you feel that this is the case?
No, I think it's what the reconciliation plan is based upon is participation. And I think most importantly, participation also means that voices continue to be heard, whether it comes from the Reds, the Yellows, the left or the right, the government or the opposition. And I think that's the most important component, that so long as we're able to bring all the stakeholders involved in the conflict on board, I think we have a real chance of moving ahead once again.
Now, I understand you're saying that, but at the same time, the actions undertaken by the current government seems to be the opposite of that statement.
In which regard?
The CRES, for example, has increased censorship instead of lessening it, has taken steps to increase a hold on free speech instead of letting everyone state their views.
Well, I think if you turn on the TV and read any of the newspapers, you'd see that actually most of both the broadcast as well as the printed media continue to be quite critical of the government, including the CRES. But I think what is of concern to some parties is the ability for the government to separate the people who have been involved with the violence during the elections, the demonstrations that have resulted in the loss of lives, to be accountable. I think the real challenge is in discerning between the peaceful demonstrators, most of whom the red shirts were unbeknownst that there were militias moving among their ranks. And I think that the people who have participated peacefully will have their rights respected, and I think that has been the main line.
Recently, I'm citing a case in Chiang Mai where there were student demonstrators, aged 15 to 18, who had a very unassuming placard without a violent message, and they were arrested and sent to re-education camp, quote unquote.
Yeah, actually, that as soon as that has been known to the government, the Prime Minister very clearly said that was quite unacceptable, and that no students or any person, for that matter, who have exercised their free speech, their voice, without instigating or resulting to violence, will not be prosecuted. It's not a matter of being prosecuted and granting a pardon, but they will not be prosecuted or be held accountable for their
Doesn't the
actions.
fact that they were arrested create a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak out just because they are arrested, regardless of whether they're brought to trial or not?
Well, I think that firstly, I think the immediate concern after the violence is to ensure the public safety, at least in areas where there was widespread rioting, there were acts of terrorism in some of the hard-hit areas. We see buildings being burnt down in more than 10 provinces. So I think to ensure the safety, to enforce the law, and to bring accountability and responsibility to those few people who were involved has been the primary concern. But I think any arrests or detention held outside that scope, will not take place.
Fair enough. Now, Sontit Limthongkul, everyone's favorite person, has recently come out to say there's more corruption under this Democrat government than there ever was under Pheu Thai. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think his exact words were that whereas Prime Minister Thaksin centralized the graft and corruption, there have appeared instances of corruption under the present government in a decentralized manner. And I think that's definitely something that the government hears and is concerned about. And I think if one thing that Prime Minister Abhisit has set a standard in Thai politics is that he said that the political conduct should be more than responsibility merely under the law. So by recognizing that corruption is a serious threat to society, I think in some ways it has also brought these cases up to light. You can give an alternative comparison where when corruption is not taken seriously, then news does not break. So I think that it's something that the country has encountered for quite a long time in many governments, and it's a challenge that we must overcome.
Now, many people hear that message and they see the steps that the Prime Minister is taking to battle corruptions inside politicians, but they also view the Democrats as working very closely with the army, an entity that many feel are very among the most corrupt among Thai entities. How do you justify that sort of partnership, if you will?
Well, I think the military is clearly being tasked with the job of security. And in the past, you see the military being politicized or actually taking part and taking sides.
Are you saying they're not politicized right now?
No, absolutely not.
They're not.
I think it's very, very clear that institutions such as the military or the monarchy have been accused as being brought into the political conflict. And I think it's a responsibility of the government to make sure that nobody brings those institutions into the political conflict and that they remain impartial to politics.
You mentioned the politicization of the monarchy as an institution. Some of that stems from the Lèse Majesté laws. Is there a reform of those laws on the horizon?
Well, if you look at the manner in which the Lèse Majesté law has been enforced during the Abhisit government, you'd see many changes. For example, in the past, anybody who goes to the authorities on Lèse Majesté, those cases will be pursued. Now we're saying that it's only cases where there is clear effect on national security in terms of possibly leading to conflict and violence, that those cases will be prosecuted. In the very same manner as any other laws governing common individuals, such as libel suits. But in terms of using Lèse Majesté as an intimidation, I think it's very clear that even in many foreign reports of journalists that have criticized or touched upon the issue of the monarchy, I think the government has respected. Those
is the government going to find distinction between criticizing and critically objecting?
Yes, well, I think one must look at the Lèse Majesté law in the Thai context in the narrow enforcement. In terms of, in the past, the institution has been used as an instrument to create divisiveness and violence.
Sure.
And I think it's only in those circumstances where the government must act to prevent the use of the monarchy to basically cause social disruptions or unrest.
So just to go back to the question,
yes.
Are we going to reform the laws? Or?
Well, I think the way the law has been enforced is already being reformed, and now the government has basically said that those cases where someone just claims that another person undertook Lèse Majesté will not be pursued.
Sure. Now going back to the elections, what what circumstances, what criteria would there have to be for elections to occur?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has made it very clear that he sees three preconditions for an election to take place. Firstly, is that the economic crisis should be addressed and solved. And I think in many ways the government has already done that. I mean, the economic growth is now back into positive territory. We'll probably post a strong 7% growth this year. So I think that precondition has been fulfilled. Secondly, a new round of political reform ought to take place.
Elaborate on political reform?
Well, basically some issues which many of the people involved in the conflict see as being some of the root causes or being unconstitutional or undemocratic. I think those issues ought to be debated, and if that would lead to reconciliation, I think.
Do you see a problem with one of the major factions in the so-called protests and unrest trying to implement reconciliation as a hindrance to reconciliation?
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of it's easier said than done. I think reconciliation also involves various parties
Sure.
taking a step backwards and looking at a larger picture and doing what they can to avoid further an escalation of conflict. I think being that the crisis has a root cause from politics, I think it is incumbent upon politicians to be a solution rather than the cause of the current problem. Okay. I think thirdly, I think what is also very important is that any election which takes place must be peaceful, must not resort to violence,
sure.
Must not resume back to periods where you are not able to campaign safely. So
right.
I think those three conditions are being met, and hopefully we can have elections sometime next year.
So, is that a yes? Sometimes next year?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr.
Yes.
Buranaj.
Thanks.
And we appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Thanks for having me, and always glad to be on.
Thank you.